So welcome to Professor Alessio D'Angelo and welcome to Professor Enrico Gargiulo. Let's start talking about invisible borders for EU citizens today. The first question that would be interesting to address is rather general. The gap existing between the rhetoric of freedom of movement and residence for European citizens within the UE space and the reality of the limits imposed sometimes in an emergency and very often in a structural, both to the circulation and above all to the stay. Mr. D'Angelo.
Okay, well, that's a complex issue really, because we know that freedom of movement has been one of the pillars of the European Union project from the very beginning. And like many other rights out there, the idea was to put it into kind of constitutional agreements and assuming that from that rights will simply derive and be applied kind of just on that basis, really. I mean, the reality, of course, is much more complex, much more complicated. And I suppose one of the original sins there is to assume that freedom of movement is something that resolves any other barrier that normally characterizes the experience of migrants. So the whole construct of the European Union is that because there is freedom of movement, EU citizens are by definition not migrants, and because they are not migrants, they're not going to face any of the barriers that migrants normally do face. And in fact, the experience of the last few decades across Europe, and particularly after the enlargement, kind of show that this is far from reality, and that reality is much more complex, and that people moving around from Europe, and particularly from the east and south to the north of Europe, face cultural barriers, but also barriers in terms of being able to access their rights, access public services, for example, being equal in terms of the local job market, and so on and so forth. And again, precisely the fact that the European Union kind of constitutionally doesn't even recognize or allows us to recognize that as an issue, it's already one of the stumbling blocks to begin with.
Thank you very much. And what about, in your opinion, Mr. Gargiulo?
I agree with Alessio. I think that all these barriers against the free circulation of EU citizens directly affects one of the pillars of European Union. The other one is the idea of solidarity among states. And basically, the fact that it's not so easy, and sometimes it's quite difficult to circulate, and especially to settle within another state for EU citizens, means that we do not live in a European sovereign state, so super state. We do not live within something that resembles a state, unless we think to a state that has internal barriers, something like the Italian state during the laws against urbanism, so the fascist regime of the Italian state, or the former Soviet Union with the system of internal passport, of the current China state with UQ system. If we think to such a kind of state, we have the same situation, because European citizens can move freely within the other states, unless there are reasons of public order, security, hygiene, something like that. But he or she is not actually free to settle within another state. He or she has to satisfy some requirements in order to settle. So this means that is a vulnerability of the idea of we are all citizens of the same big state, that we can choose in which part of it to live. So just a rhetoric that is quite diminished by all these kind of barriers.
Thank you very much. It's clear. And you talked about settling. With respect to the specific scheme of residence, I'd like to highlight the ambiguity of an instrument designed on one hand to control the population and its movements, and on the other to guarantee the exercise of rights. From this perspective, the restrictive and selective use of the registry produces invisible borders in the sense of immaterial and not perceived by the people who find them in front of them, unaware of the personal data rules, which produce invisibility, That is, they don't make people knowable by part of institutions with a paradoxical effect. The right to residence is restricted in the name of security, and as a result, people are made unknown by the authorities. What do you think about this, Alessio? You had to open your microphone, maybe.
Okay, so yeah, also in that respect, I think there is, if you want to call it that, an original sin with the whole idea of what residency is about, and Enrico and myself have written recently about how that instrument has been used in very ambiguous ways across Europe, in very different ways across Europe, but in the end to pursue very similar aims, very similar ends. And so residency at surface is an administrative mechanism which is there to allow people to recognize as, you know, settled in a particular local area, and on that basis you are accessing welfare and accessing other kinds of public services. That's the theory. The practice is that the instrument of residency and the way in which residency is ascertained and tested increasingly has become a kind of mechanism of internal bordering, as some people have called it. So a way to filter those who have full entitlement to settlement rights and those who don't. And that screening is not simply done on the basis of nationality or on the basis of migration status, but very often is done on the basis of other types of, well, what in effect are social stratification. So in terms of class, in terms of economic position, in terms of race, or in terms of stereotypes which are associated to certain groups of people. So in a way, it becomes an additional level of selection, additional level of screening, a bit less visible, but in some cases even much more effective than the external borders. We used to think about migration as something which is primarily regulated by the external borders, but increasingly, precisely, we see mechanisms of internal bordering, whereby the onus and the responsibility of demonstrating your right to be a resident is on the individuals, and very often for the most marginalized in society, including migrants, including EU migrants. Well, that burden is particularly high and is particularly significant. If I can add an additional point, the other paradox of the whole European project is that we've been told for decades that the external borders, the so-called idea of Fortress Europe, was thereby in order to create a free space of movement within its borders. So the idea was, we need to be very tough with the external frontiers so that we can remove the internal frontiers. But in fact, what we've seen, particularly over the next 10, 15 years or so, is those two things going in parallel. So the more the European Union has become rigid in terms of its external frontiers, the more actually at the same time you've seen the multiplication of internal borders as well, because bordering is really kind of a political ideology, I would call it. And so it's not really about internal or external, it's about the whole idea of managing society by stratification of rights and entitlements. And residency is one of the many mechanisms in which that idea is implemented.
Okay, it's clear, and I agree with you. And what do you think about it, Enrico?
Yeah, I completely agree with Alessio, and in our article we try to use a couple of conceptual categories. First one is civic stratification, and the European Union today illustrates clearly this mechanism and this kind of structure. We live in a space in which there are a lot of people that appear as similar each other, but quite different because they have different statuses, different formal statuses that allow them to have different rights in many cases. Some of these rights are quite strategic for their lives. For instance, right to circulate, right to social assistance, right to health assistance, to education, and so on. So residency increases the system of civic stratification, complicates the system, the structure. The second category is differential inclusion, meaning that There are people who live together, they are physically included within a space, and there are, in some cases, also socially included, but they are formally in part excluded. If this formal exclusion, in this case, the exclusion from the formal status of resident, means being excluded from rights, and in some cases, being at the risk of being deported, because for EU citizens not have a residency, a formal residency in other states, can mean being at risk of being forced to leave that country. So residency is strategic from this perspective, illustrates all the ambiguities, not only of European project, but of some states. Italy and UK are quite different from this perspective. In Italy, there is a strong rhetoric of security. In the name of security, in some cases, migrants are excluded from residency, for instance, as an effect of the Salvini decree. But this is paradoxical because residency was introduced in Italy just to control the territory of the population. So it's the denial of residency to specific categories of migrants creates a paradoxical effect and creates invisibility, where residency should allow visibility, should make people visible to states and institutions. The concept of visibility, of the opposition, visibility, invisibility, illustrates clearly how it's paradoxical this situation, how the use of residency creates a sort of legal and material monster.
And it's so well. It was very kind of you, professors. Thank you very much to you all, and enjoy keyformobility.eu.